Hi everyone. I'm going to begin by telling you a little about O. Henry because today's story was written by him. So O. Henry was an American short story writer. His real name was William Sidney Porter. His writing is full of metaphor, exaggeration, metonymy, and irony. His stories are touching and deep. His endings are surprising and unexpected. Today, I have one of his very famous stories for you. It is called After 20 Years. I would say that the name of the story is well thought of and arouses your curiosity, doesn't it? So let's see what happens after 20 years. What is the story all about? I will read and explain it to you as we go along. And when we come to the end of the story, I have a few simple questions for you to test your comprehension skills. May I suggest that you make time to read through the story again after we have completed the lesson. That will help you to improve your pronunciation, spelling, and vocabulary. If you get stuck anywhere, you can always go back to the video for help. So now, without much ado, let's start with the story After 20 Years. After 20 Years by O. Henry. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. That means the policeman who was on duty moved up the wide street impressively in a way that aroused admiration. Why did he do that? The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. He did not try to impress anyone to show off to them. He just did that because it was a habit. He did not need to show off to anyone because spectators were few. What do I mean by spectators? Spectators are people who observe, who watch something. There is a difference between the words spectators and audience. Spectators are people who only watch, who see something. Audience are those who not only see something, but hear as well. So if you were at a play, you would be part of the audience because you would be watching and listening. But these people here on the street were spectators. They were only looking, they were watching. And they were very few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well nigh de-peopled the streets. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night. That means it was not yet 10. It was round about 10, but it was quite cold. Chilly gusts of wind. It was windy and it seemed like it might rain because there was a taste of rain in the wind. That means, you know, when it's about to rain, the wind feels like it's kind of wet. Because the weather was like that, there was hardly anyone on the streets. De-peopled meaning no people on the streets. Nigh means near. So there were no people there. Trying doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye adown the Pacific thoroughfare, the officer, with his stalwart form and slight swagger, made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter, but the majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. So what did the policeman do? He walked up and down that street, trying doors as he went, checking the doors, twirling his club, twisting his club around with many intricate and artful movements, meaning complex movements. Okay, a club is a heavy stick that you can use as a weapon. And every now and then he turned to check what was happening up and down the street. He had a stalwart form. That means he was sturdy, strong, robust. And he had a slight swagger. That means he walked proudly. He made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. That means anyone who looked at him would feel safe and protected because it seemed like he was capable of doing his duty. The vicinity, the area, was one that kept early hours. That means everyone closed their shops and went home early. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store. The only thing you might see open there would be a cigar store or an all-night lunch counter. People might need to eat during the night, so that might be open. But the majority of the doors belong to business places. Shops, they did not need to be open late at night. So they had long since been closed. They had been closed long ago. When about midway of a certain block, the policeman suddenly slowed his walk. In the doorway of a darkened hardware store, a man leaned with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly. "It's all right, officer," he said reassuringly. "I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. Sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it? Well, I'll explain if you'd like to make certain it's all straight. About that long ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store stands, Big Joe Brady's restaurant. Until 5 years ago," said the policeman. "It was torn down then." So, when the policeman was taking his rounds, when he was about halfway down a certain block, he slowed down because he noticed that there was a man standing in the dark. He was leaning against the doorway of one of the hardware stores, and he had a cigar in his mouth which he had not lit yet. So the policeman walked up to him, and the man, of course, knew that he looked suspicious standing there in the dark. So he reassured the officer. He told the officer, "It's okay. I'm not causing any trouble to anyone. I'm just standing here because I'm waiting for a friend. It might sound strange to you, but 20 years ago, my friend and I made a promise that we would meet here 20 years hence. If we were both still alive, we would definitely meet over here. There used to be a restaurant here, and it was called Big Joe Brady's restaurant, and we had decided at that time that we would meet here." So the policeman says, "Yes, there was a restaurant here called Big Joe Brady's restaurant, but 5 years ago it was torn down." The man in the doorway struck a match and lit his cigar. The light showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set. 20 years ago tonight," said the man, "I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum, and the finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York, just like two brothers together. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning I was to start for the West to make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what our conditions might be or from what distance we might have to come. We figured that in 20 years, each of us ought to have our destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be." So the man in the doorway, who seemed suspicious to the policeman, struck a match and lit his cigar. And the minute he did that, the policeman was able to have a better look at him. What did the policeman see? He saw a pale, square-jawed face The man had square face with keen eyes, smart, alert eyes, and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. And he was wearing a tie pin, which had a large diamond in it, which was set in a very strange way. And the man began to talk to the policeman and explain to him how he had made plans with his best friend, best chum meaning best friend, Jimmy Wells, who was best person in the entire world, chap, fellow. And they were both raised in New York like two brothers. But they met there at that restaurant because the next day, the next morning, this man was going to leave for the West. He was going to Chicago, which was towards the west of New York, because he wanted to earn money. He wanted to do something with his life. Jimmy, of course, Jimmy Wells, his best friend, would never leave New York because he loved it. He thought it was the only place on earth. So they both decided that no matter where their fortunes took them, where they went to make money, where their destiny took them, where luck took them, it didn't matter, but 20 years hence, they would both meet in the same place. It sounds pretty interesting, said the policeman. Rather a long time between meets, though, it seems to me. Haven't you heard from your friend since you left? Well, yes, for a time we corresponded, said the other. But after a year or two, we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around over it pretty lively. But I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive, for he always was the truest, stanchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand in this door tonight, and it's worth it if my old partner turns up. The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. 3 minutes to 10, he announced. It was exactly 10 o'clock when we parted here at the restaurant door. Did pretty well out west, didn't you? Asked the policeman. So the policeman says, wow, that sounds like an interesting story. But 20 years is a long time. Did you not keep in touch with your friend? So the man says, oh yes, we did write to each other for some time, but after a year or two, we lost track of each other because you see, I was in the West, I was in Chicago, and it is a busy life over there. I was hustling around, moving around rapidly from one thing to another, full of life. But I know that my friend Jimmy Wells will meet me here if he's alive. Why? Because he was that kind of person. If he promised someone something, he would keep his promise. He will never forget. And I have come 1,000 miles to stand here and wait for him. So I really hope that he comes. And while he was talking to the policeman, this man takes out his watch to see what the time is. And the policeman notices that his watch is a beautiful one, an expensive one. The lid has small diamonds in it. So while he announces 3 minutes to 10, so, by 10 o'clock, my friend should be here, the policeman asks him, you seem to have done very well in the West. Why? Because now the policeman has noticed his tie pin and his watch, and they are both very expensive things. Only a rich man could have possessed such expensive things. You bet. I hope Jimmy has done half as well. He was a kind of plodder, though good fellow as he was. I've had to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. A man gets in a groove in New York. It takes the West to put a razor edge on him. The policeman twirled his club and took a step or two. I'll be on my way. Hope your friend comes around all right. Going to call time on him sharp? I should say not, said the other. I'll give him half an hour at least. If Jimmy is alive on earth, he'll be here by that time. So long, officer. Good night, sir, said the policeman, passing on along his beat, trying doors as he went. So, what does the man say? He says, you bet, Jimmy. I hope that Jimmy has done half as well as I have done. You bet meaning, yes, I have done very well in the West. I've earned a lot of money, and I hope my friend Jimmy has done half as well as I have done. Because he was not the kind of person I was. He was a kind of plodder, a little slow, but a good fellow, persevering, hardworking, but slow. I have been in the West. I have been there and I have had to work very hard to get my pile, meaning to get my money, to earn my money. I've had to compete with the sharpest wits. I've had to be all there, think carefully, or I would never be able to get what I got. A man gets in a groove in New York. When you live in New York, you sort of get into a fixed way of doing things. It takes the West to put a razor edge on him. Razor, you know what a razor is like? It's really sharp. So if you need to get your mind sharp like a razor, you need to be in a place like in the West. And the policeman twirled his club and decided that he should move on. So he says, okay, I'm on my way now. I hope your friend comes. So going to call time on him sharp means, are you going to wait only till 10 o'clock and then move on? So the man says, I should say not. He said, no, I'm not going to wait only till 10. I'll give him half an hour at least. I'll wait till 10:30. If Jimmy is alive on earth, he'll be here by that time. And he says, okay, officer, so long. Bye. See you soon. And the policeman says good night to him and walks down the street, trying doors as he goes past. There was now a fine, cold drizzle falling, and the wind had risen from its uncertain puffs into a steady blow. The few foot passengers astir in that quarter hurried dismally and silently along with coat collars turned high and pocketed hands. And in the door of the hardware store, the man who had come 1,000 miles to fill an appointment, uncertain almost to absurdity, with a friend of his youth, smoked his cigar and waited. About 20 minutes he waited, and then a tall man in a long overcoat with collar turned up to his ears hurried across from the opposite side of the street. He went directly to the waiting man. Is that you, Bob? He asked doubtfully. Is that you, Jimmy Wells? Cried the man in the door. So, in the beginning of the story, we heard that the weather was bad, but now it had turned worse. There was a fine drizzle. It was drizzling. It was raining slightly, and it was really cold. The wind, which had uncertain puffs, that means it was blowing and then stopping and then blowing and then stopping, like how you puff, was now a steady blow. It was blowing really hard, steadily. The few foot passengers, that means people who were walking around, very few of them, astir moving in that quarter, hurried dismally and silently along with coat collars turned high and pocketed hands. They started feeling cold. They, dismally meaning sadly and silently, they put their coat collars high to stop feeling so cold, put their hands in their pockets and moved on, hurried away. And in the door of the hardware store, the man who had come 1,000 miles, he was really uncertain, almost to absurdity. That means he was really not even certain if his friend would show up. It was absurd. It was a crazy thing. He was that uncertain, okay, senseless, with a friend of his youth, his old friend from 20 years ago. He smoked his cigar and waited. And after 20 minutes, there was a tall man in a long overcoat who appeared suddenly, with the collar turned up to his ears because it was cold. And he came directly to the waiting man and said, is that you, Bob? Doubtfully, because he had a doubt whether that was really Bob. And the man who was there smoking his cigar said, is that you, Jimmy Wells? Bless my heart, exclaimed the new arrival. New arrival, the man who had just come, grasping both the other's hands with his own. It's Bob, sure as fate. I was certain I'd find you here if you were still in existence. Well, 20 years is a long time. The old gone Bob. I wish it had lasted, so we could have had another dinner there. How has the West treated you, old man? Bully, it has given me everything I asked it for. You've changed lots, Jimmy. I never thought you were so tall by 2 or 3 inches. Oh, I grew a bit after I was 20. Doing well in New York, Jimmy? Moderately. I have a position in one of the city departments. Come on, Bob, we'll go around to a place I know of and have a good long talk about old times. So now a man has arrived and he has introduced himself as Jimmy Wells. And now Bob is so excited that he has met his friend. So so Jimmy Wells holds Bob's hands with his own and says, I was so certain that I would find you here. And I am so sorry that the old restaurant where we dined 20 years ago is no longer here. But because if it was here, we would have dined here again tonight. So how has the West treated you? And Bob says, bully. This is an expression. It means excellent. That means the West has treated him really well. It has given me everything I asked it for. You've changed lots, Jimmy, he said. You know, you look taller, like you have grown 2 or 3 inches. So Jimmy Wells says, yes, I grew a bit after I was 20. Now that's really strange if you look at it, because people don't really grow after they're 20. 2, 3 inches? Not really possible. Doing well in New York, Jimmy? And he says, well, not really that well, moderately. And I work in one of the city departments, but come, we'll go around to a place that I know and we'll sit there and have a good long talk about old times. The two men started up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. At the corner stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the West stopped suddenly and released his arm. You're not Jimmy Wells, he snapped. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug. Let me explain this part. So the two men started up the street. They were walking arm in arm. The man from the West, we're talking about Bob here, had an ego which was enlarged by success. He had been so successful, earned such a lot of money that he had a huge ego. He was boasting. He was telling his friend all about his career. And the other, the friend, was submerged in his overcoat, his overcoat right up to his ears. He was listening to him with interest. Now, what happens is they come to a place which is lit up. There was a drugstore there, and a drugstore has to be lit up because people go to buy medicines any time of the day or night. So it was lit up. It was brilliant. It was bright with electric lights. So as soon as they came into the light, they both turned at the same time to look at each other's face. And that's when the man from the West stopped and withdrew his arm from the other man. And he snapped. He said immediately, you are not my friend. You are not Jimmy Wells. So 20 years is definitely a long time. People change. But a man's nose can never change. That is why when when criminals are arrested and they are taken for their profile picture to be taken, they are made to turn sideways because the shape of the nose is taken. Because the shape of the nose never changes. You might be able to wear contact lenses and change your hair and all kinds of things, but the shape of your nose will never change no matter what you do. I don't know about these days though, with plastic surgery and things like that. Maybe that's possible, but I mean, actually the shape of a man's nose cannot change. Unless you do plastic surgery on it, I suppose. But in those days, of course, there was no plastic surgery. So what he means is from a Roman to a pig, meaning a Roman, a man from Rome, usually had a nose with a prominent bridge. The bridge is that line on top. and it would be slightly curved or bent, a prominent, nice nose with a slightly curved edge. So, and a pug's nose, if you have seen a pug, you know what a pug's nose looks like. It's like flat, right? So he says, how could a man's nose change from one that has a prominent bridge and slightly hooked to something that's totally flat? Not possible. So you are definitely not my friend. It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one, said the tall man. You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. Chicago thinks you may have dropped over our way and wires us she wants to have a chat with you. Going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go on to the station, here's a note I was asked to hand you. You may read it here at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells. The man from the west unfolded the little piece of paper handed him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was rather short. Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plainclothesman to do the job, Jimmy. That's how the story ends. So what happened? When Bob tells Jimmy, or rather the tall man standing by his side, that he is not Jimmy Wells, because a man's nose cannot change so much in 20 years or even 40 years. So the tall man tells him, maybe a nose cannot change, but a good man can change into a bad one, and that's really sad. So you have been under arrest for the past 10 minutes while we were walking, because you are Silky Bob. That was the name they knew him by. Silky, because he is probably, you know what silk is like, it can slip out of anything. So he's probably evaded the police for a long time. Chicago thinks you may have dropped our way. Chicago, here it's personified, and they're pretending that Chicago is a person, a woman. It's a place in the West where Bob used to be. So Chicago thinks you may have dropped away and wires us. In those days, a telegram was sent. So wires us, she wants to have a chat with you. Chicago wanted him. He was a wanted person. He was a criminal. And so the policeman tells him, it's sensible for you to go quietly. Don't try to run. Now, before we go on to the station, the police station, here's a note that I have been asked to give you. You may read it here at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells. So now I guess you know who Patrolman Wells is, the man in the beginning of the story who stopped to talk to him. He was actually Bob's friend, Jimmy Wells, but he did not disclose that fact to him because he could not. As soon as Bob lit his cigar, there was light, and Jimmy Wells saw his face. He knew exactly who he was, and he knew he was wanted. He was a criminal, and he could not do anything. He could not let him escape, and he could not arrest him at the same time because that was his best friend. So what did he do? He went further. He called a plainclothesman, another policeman, and he asked him to do the job, the dirty job of arresting his best friend. But he had to tell his friend Bob that he had been there at the appointed time that night. So he sent him a note and explained to him that he did come, he did keep his promise. I hope you enjoyed the story. It was a touching one, wasn't it? Do read it again and enjoy it all over again. Improve your pronunciation, improve your English. We'll meet again soon. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves, and I'll say bye for now. Cheerio.